You'd think being kind would protect you from being hated. But strangely, it often puts a target on your back. That's the paradox, isn't it? You go out into the world with an open heart, a gentle voice, and an intention to do no harm. Yet somehow you become the villain in someone else's story. Let's talk about why. First, understand this. People carry within them unseen battles, buried shame, unresolved anger. And when they meet someone kind, that person becomes a mirror. A mirror that reflects not only who they are, but who they are not. Kindness doesn't just comfort. It confronts. It reminds others of the parts of themselves they've abandoned. And when people see that mirror, many don't say, "Wow, what a beautiful soul." They say, "I hate that they make me feel this way." Second, kindness can feel threatening. In a world where manipulation often masquerades as connection, genuine warmth feels suspicious. Why are they being so nice? What do they want? Are they faking it? Because when someone lies behind masks, they struggle to trust faces that don't hide. Third, your light may awaken their darkness. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you did everything right. Your kindness disrupts the illusion they live in, that everyone is out to get them. That love must be earned. That trust is a weakness. So what do? They attack what they don't understand. They hate what they can't control. They resent what they cannot become. But here's the truth. Their hatred is not about you. It's about the war they're losing inside themselves. So what can you do? You stay kind, but you stay wise. You don't dull your light, but you stop expecting everyone to appreciate its warmth. You set boundaries, not because you're unkind, but because your kindness deserves a safe place to live. And if you walk away with just one thing today, let it be this: being hated for your kindness says more about their pain than your value. Don't harden your heart to survive a world that needs your softness to heal. There is a part of the human psyche that we rarely acknowledge, the part we hide not just from others, but even from ourselves. It holds our insecurities, our envy, our rage, the emotions we've learned are unacceptable or unlovable. These buried aspects do not disappear. Instead, they retreat into what can be called the shadow, the unconscious region of the mind where we store everything we've disowned about ourselves. The shadow isn't just made of bad traits. It includes any part of ourselves we reject, suppress, or feel we aren't allowed to express. For some, that might be vulnerability. For others, it could be ambition, sexuality, or even creativity. Whatever society, family, or personal trauma has taught us to fear or avoid, we banish to this psychological basement. But here's the problem: the shadow does not stay silent. It seeks expression, often in distorted and unconscious ways. And one of the most common ways this happens is projection, the act of attributing our own unwanted traits, emotions, or motives to someone else. Imagine a person who has repressed their anger for years. Maybe they were raised in a household where expressing anger led to punishment or rejection. Over time, they internalized the belief that anger is bad and buried it deep. But this anger still exists. It leaks out sideways, not through direct confrontation, but by labeling others as aggressive, or hostile, or too intense, even when those people are simply being assertive or passionate. This is projection in action. Projection allows people to avoid taking ownership of their inner conflicts. Rather than facing the discomfort of saying, "This is in me," they say, This is in you. In this way, the world becomes a canvas for our unconscious mind. What we refuse to face within ourselves, we begin to see and often criticize in others. This mechanism is incredibly common. It's the reason someone who struggles with jealousy might accuse their partner of being unfaithful even without evidence. It's why someone deeply insecure might label others as arrogant. The traits that live in their shadow, the ones they can't consciously tolerate, get painted onto other people. And more often than not, the targets of projection are not doing anything wrong. In fact, they are often people who embody something the projector cannot access within themselves. Now consider the emotional experience of the one being projected onto. Often, these people are kind, balanced, and emotionally aware, yet they find themselves suddenly disliked, criticized, or even attacked by someone they barely know. This creates confusion and emotional pain. Why am I being treated this way? What did I do? The truth is, in many cases, they didn't do anything. Their mere presence triggered something unprocessed in the other person. Their confidence reminded someone of their own insecurity. Their openness unearthed someone else's guardedness. Their kindness stirred guilt, shame, or a sense of inadequacy in another. Projection is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, like being labeled too sensitive by someone who is emotionally shut down, or being called controlling by someone who struggles with setting boundaries themselves. But whether loud or quiet, projection distorts human relationships. It makes others into mirrors, not of who they truly are, but of what the projector cannot face. This process doesn't just happen individually, it plays out collectively. Entire groups, communities, even nations can project their shadow onto others. Historical examples abound. Marginalized groups demonized for supposedly corrupting the purity of a society, or political opponents caricatured as evil incarnate. These large-scale projections often stem from collective denial, a refusal to acknowledge the dark sides of a culture or ideology. What makes projection particularly dangerous is that it feels real. When someone projects, they don't know they're doing it. They genuinely believe that the problem lies outside of them. In fact, the more intense the projection, the more unconscious it is. It hijacks perception, clouds judgment, and justifies irrational behavior. To the projector, the world appears distorted, not because the world has changed, but because they are seeing it through the lens of their own disowned self. And this is why kindness can provoke hostility. A kind person may unwittingly reflect a shadow element back at someone, not through judgment, but simply by existing. They show up with presence, openness, or authenticity, and this becomes intolerable to someone who has buried those qualities within themselves. Instead of admiration, what arises is discomfort. Instead of curiosity, there is criticism. The mind finds a way to reframe the situation so that the problem is externalized. The kind person becomes fake, naïve, manipulative, or annoying. The projector finds a narrative that supports their discomfort because facing the truth would mean confronting their own shadow. Shadow projection is not a failure of morality, it's a failure of awareness. And awareness is rare because it's hard. To recognize that you are projecting is to admit that the very things you judge in others might live inside you. It requires emotional maturity, self-reflection, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Most people aren't ready for that. They'd rather blame distance and reject and look inward. And so projections continue, relationships break, misunderstandings grow, people remain trapped in cycles they don't even realize they are repeating. Kindness can trigger insecurity. At first glance, kindness seems like something universally welcomed. A soft balm in a harsh world is taught in childhood, praised in society, and often romanticized in media. People are told to be nice, to treat others well, to lead with compassion. Yet strangely, in real life, genuine kindness does not always create connection. In some cases, it evokes discomfort, defensiveness, even hostility. This contradiction isn't always easy to recognize, but it speaks to something deeper. The fact that kindness, especially when unfiltered and sincere, can trigger insecurity in others. To understand this, one must look beneath the surface of social interaction. On the outside, people may smile, nod, or return pleasantries. But underneath, many are carrying quiet wounds, feelings of inadequacy, unworthiness, fear of being exposed, or the belief that love and kindness must be earned, not given freely. When they encounter someone who offers warmth without condition, it contradicts the inner belief system they've built to protect themselves. If a person has internalized the idea that they are fundamentally not good enough, then unconditional kindness won't feel safe. It will feel suspicious. It won't feel deserved. It will feel invasive. In this state, kindness doesn't affirm them. It exposes them. It forces them to confront the painful gap between how they see themselves and how they are being treated. Rather than feeling appreciated, they feel confronted by something they can't explain. There's also the reality that many people associate kindness with manipulation. In environments where love or care came with strings attached, where warmth was used as a tool of control or guilt, people learn to see kindness as a transaction. So when someone offers it freely, without agenda, it feels threatening. The thought arises, what do they want from me? Suspicion replaces gratitude. Defense replaces trust. Insecurity begins to speak louder than reason. Kindness also has a way of bringing attention to contrast. When someone who is open-hearted walks into a space where emotional detachment is the norm, they create a kind of psychological dissonance. Their softness reveals the hardness in others. Their patience highlights someone else's restlessness. Their generosity reminds others of their guardedness. And instead of inspiring reflection, this contrast often triggers shame, a quiet inner judgment that says, why can't I be more like that? But because shame is so difficult to sit with, it's projected outward instead. The kind person becomes too much, fake, attention-seeking, or trying too hard. It's easier to critique what triggers you than to explore why it does. In workplaces, schools, or even families, this dynamic plays out in subtle but powerful ways. A kind person may be perceived as weak or naive. Their attempts to connect might be mocked behind their back. Their warmth might be met with coolness, sarcasm, or passive aggression. These reactions aren't always about the kind person at all. They're about the insecurities their presence stirs in others. For someone who has built their identity around control, performance, or emotional distance, being around someone who leads with sincerity can feel like a threat to their emotional armor. And yet, the kind person might not realize any of this. They might think they're doing something wrong. They might start to question themselves. Did I come on too strong? Was I being fake? Should I be more reserved? the internal confusion begins. The irony is that their only mistake was showing up with openness in a space where others have learned to survive by closing off. It's important to recognize that insecurity is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it hides behind politeness. A person may seem friendly on the surface, but keep a kind person at a subtle emotional distance. Or they might respond with competitive energy, needing to outdo the kindness to regain a sense of control. In group settings, insecure individuals may even align with others in passive rejection, forming an unspoken consensus that someone's warmth is too much, simply because it makes them feel exposed. There's also a class of people who are deeply uncomfortable receiving. To accept kindness means acknowledging need, vulnerability, or a lack of self-sufficiency. And for many, this is intolerable. These individuals may be very giving themselves, but when roles are reversed and someone shows them the same compassion they so freely offer, it disrupts their sense of identity. They respond not with gratitude, but with unease. They may deflect compliments, change the subject, or downplay the gesture. It's not that they dislike kindness. It's that they don't know how to feel worthy of it. In some cases, kindness also touches on deeper trauma. For those who grew up in emotionally unpredictable or abusive environments, kindness can feel alien. They may not recognize it as safe. In fact, it may feel more threatening than cruelty, simply because cruelty is familiar. The nervous system doesn't always distinguish good from bad. It distinguishes familiar from unfamiliar, and if pain was the baseline, then love feels destabilizing. Kindness disrupts the internal narrative. It says, you are worthy just as you are, but if someone's entire self-concept is built on the opposite belief, that message creates confusion and even panic. This complexity is why people sometimes lash out at those who are kind to them. Not because they hate kindness, but because they can't integrate it. It highlights an internal conflict. It invites them to soften when they've only ever learned to harden. And rather than accept that invitation, they reject the messenger. They reject the reflection. They reject the part of themselves that is still reaching quietly for something they've convinced themselves they don't deserve. Authenticity is threatening in a culture built on performance, image, and conformity. Authenticity can feel like rebellion. It is often praised publicly, held up as an ideal in quotes, slogans, and social media captions, but in practice, authenticity disrupts the unwritten rules that govern how people relate to each other. When someone shows up without a mask, they expose the masks of everyone around them. And that is where the threat begins. To be authentic means to be deeply in tune with your values, your emotions, your boundaries, and your truth. It's not about being blunt or impulsive. It's about being real. It's about no longer performing for approval, no longer saying what's expected just to keep the peace, and no longer shrinking or twisting yourself to fit into environments where you don't belong. This kind of presence unsettles people who rely on predictability, on the quiet agreement that we will all play our roles, say the polite things, and pretend not to notice the disconnect between what we say and what we feel. Authenticity breaks that agreement. It says, I will not pretend. And that, more than anything, makes others uncomfortable. When someone is authentic, they refuse to participate in the subtle social games others have grown used to. They don't gossip to gain favor. They don't nod along to things they don't believe. They don't seek validation through conformity. Their very presence reminds people of the parts of themselves they've buried, desires they've silenced, opinions they've softened, truths they've withheld. For someone who has built their identity around social adaptation, meeting someone who no longer needs to adapt can feel threatening, even if the authentic person has no intention of making anyone else uncomfortable. The threat isn't always conscious. In fact, it rarely is. It shows up as irritation, dismissal, passive aggression, or subtle distancing. People may call the authentic person too intense, too serious, or too much. They may label their honesty as rudeness, their vulnerability as weakness, or their boundaries as arrogance. What they are actually reacting to is the discomfort of being around someone who reflects back their own lack of alignment. There's a strange kind of safety in shared dishonesty. When everyone is pretending, no one stands out. The group maintains its cohesion through unspoken compromise. But when one person decides to stop pretending, it threatens the stability of that dynamic. Suddenly, the unspoken becomes spoken. The unresolved becomes visible. The gaps between people's values and their actions become harder to ignore. Authenticity doesn't just challenge individuals, it challenges entire systems. This is especially true in professional settings. Workplaces often operate on hierarchy, politics, and controlled narratives. Authentic people, those who speak directly, admit what they don't know, or refuse to play political games, are rarely welcomed by those who thrive on power dynamics and subtle manipulation. The authentic voice becomes inconvenient. It asks uncomfortable questions. It exposes dysfunction. It can't be easily managed, but this is not limited to institutions. Even in friendships or families, authenticity can be destabilizing. For instance, someone who begins setting healthier boundaries after a lifetime of people pleasing may suddenly be seen as selfish. Not because they are doing anything harmful, but because their change forces others to reckon with how they've benefited from the lack of boundaries. Authenticity doesn't just reveal who you are, it reveals who others have become in your absence. Sometimes, authenticity is threatening because it pierces through illusion. People often hold on to identities that were shaped by survival, not by truth. They wear masks crafted from trauma, expectation, or fear, masks that say, I'm the reliable one, I'm the strong one, I'm the agreeable one. When someone comes along who refuses to wear a mask, it calls into question the necessity of all masks. It suggests, without saying anything at all, that there might be another way to live. For many, that suggestion is terrifying. It threatens not only how they see others, but how they see themselves. Authenticity also challenges the ego. The ego prefers predictability, control, and approval. It wants to be liked, to be admired, to belong. But authenticity doesn't always allow for that. An authentic person might say something unpopular. They might challenge a group's assumptions. They might stand alone, not because they want to be different, but because they cannot betray themselves to fit in. This quiet defiance unnerves those who still rely on external validation to feel okay. There is also a paradox at play. While authenticity is threatening to others, it is often born from threat. Most people do not become authentic until they are forced to, until the cost of pretending becomes too high, until the old strategies stop working, until the pain of disconnection, both from self and others, becomes unbearable. Authenticity, then, is often not a choice but a consequence. And when someone reaches that level of truth, they no longer have the energy to uphold the social performances they once participated in. They are simply too tired to be anyone else. And so they arrive in rooms, conversations, and relationships carrying an energy that is deeply grounding, but also disruptive. They are calm, but not passive, kind, but not performative, honest, but not cruel. Their words carry weight, not because they are loud, but because they are aligned, and that alignment is rare. It stands out. It demands a response, and if that response is unconscious defensiveness or silent withdrawal, authenticity doesn't always lead to closeness. In many cases, it leads to isolation, not because the authentic person pushes others away, but because others are not yet ready to meet them where they are. The authentic person may be judged, excluded, or misunderstood, not because they are wrong, but because they are no longer playing the game everyone else is still trying to win. We hate what we secretly admire or lack. Our hatred is rarely just about what's on the surface. People like to believe that they dislike others for rational, justified reasons. A personality clash, a disagreement, a moral difference. But often, hatred is not born from what another person does, but from what they represent. Beneath the sharp edge of judgment, beneath the frustration or disdain, there often lies an uncomfortable truth. We sometimes hate in others what we secretly admire, envy, or long for, qualities we've disowned in ourselves or believe we can never have. This dynamic is subtle. It's not usually felt as, I wish I were like them, so I'll hate them instead. It's unconscious. It shows up in automatic reactions, a tightening in the chest, when someone speaks confidently, a flare of irritation at someone's boldness, a harsh inner voice whispering that someone is fake, arrogant, knave, or undeserving. The mind rushes to justify the emotion, but the emotion often comes from something deeper. A confrontation with a quality we feel disconnected from in ourselves. Admiration and hatred are not opposites. They are more like twins born from the same impulse, the recognition of value. When we admire someone, we consciously acknowledge their qualities as desirable. When we hate someone for those same qualities, it often means we've labeled those traits as off limits, dangerous, or unreachable. We don't feel inspired, we feel threatened. We don't feel seen, we feel exposed. And rather than confront our own longing, we reject the person who embodies it. Consider someone who grew up in an environment where speaking up was punished. They may have learned to stay quiet, stay agreeable, stay small. Then, as an adult, they encounter someone who is unapologetically expressive, someone who takes up space, speaks with certainty, and doesn't ask for permission. Rather than feeling admiration, they might feel annoyance or disgust. Who do they think they are? They might ask themselves. But the real question lurking underneath is, why can't I be like that? This isn't just about confidence. It can apply to joy, emotional vulnerability, creativity, success, or even physical presence. Someone who has repressed their emotional needs may resent people who are openly affectionate. Someone who feels stifled in life might dislike people who chase their dreams. Someone who has spent years trying to be the responsible one might roll their eyes at people who leave spontaneously or follow their impulses. What feels like a character flaw in someone else is often a reflection of a part of the self that has been silenced, shamed, or forgotten. There's a deep psychological discomfort in seeing others freely express parts of themselves that we've had to hide. It reminds us of the compromises we've made. It stirs up grief, jealousy, and sometimes even self-loathing. But instead of turning inward to examine those feelings, many people turn outward in judgment. Hatred becomes a defense mechanism, a way to distance oneself from pain. It allows the mind to rewrite the narrative. That person is bad or annoying or full of themselves, instead of, that person reminds me of a version of me that I never got to be. This is not limited to personal dynamics. It extends to public figures, celebrities, influencers, anyone who is visibly embodying a certain kind of power, freedom, or success. People often feel an irrational level of hatred for individuals they've never met. They tear them down for being too confident, too emotional, too ambitious, too beautiful, too outspoken. But the intensity of the emotion rarely matches the actual behavior. What it matches is the depth of longing or frustration inside the hater's own psyche. The more out of reach something feels, the more likely it is to provoke resentment. If someone believes that a certain way of living is impossible for them because of internal limitations, external circumstances, or ingrained beliefs, then seeing someone else live that way feels like a personal affront. It's easier to hate the person than to confront the internalized story that says, I could never have that. I could never be that. At times, the hatred is not toward what someone has, but how effortlessly they seem to have it. Someone who has worked tirelessly to build self-worth might struggle to tolerate someone who simply owns their value without apology. Someone who has spent years trying to be accepted might feel repelled by someone who doesn't seem to care what others think. It isn't just what the other person possesses. It's the grace or ease with which they seem to carry it. That ease shines a light on how much effort others have had to exert just to feel okay. This projection creates distorted relationships. It keeps people locked in comparison, judgment, and false narratives. The admired, hated person is rarely aware of the emotional storm they've triggered. They may wonder why they're disliked or judged so harshly when they've done nothing wrong. But in many cases, their only offense was being themselves, in a way that someone else doesn't believe is allowed. What complicates this even more is that sometimes hatred masks a desire for connection. In certain cases, the person doing the hating doesn't want the other to fail. They want to be seen by them, accepted by them, or even guided by them. But the gap between admiration and perceived unworthiness is so wide that the only way to protect the ego is to attack. Hatred becomes a shield protecting the deeper wound of feeling unseen or incapable. People rarely speak about this dynamic because it reveals too much. It admits to envy. It admits to vulnerability. It requires the humility to acknowledge, I dislike this person, not because they're wrong, but because they embody something I've denied in myself. And that kind of honesty is hard. It requires dismantling old stories. It requires grieving lost versions of self. It requires the courage to reclaim the parts that were abandoned, not because they were wrong, but because they were too threatening to those around us at the time. Not everyone is ready to heal. Healing is often spoken about as a journey, a return to wholeness, a process of shedding what no longer serves us and integrating what we've denied. It's painted as noble, transformative, even urgent. In many ways, it is. But the truth that's rarely acknowledged is this: not everyone is ready to heal, and some never will be. The idea of healing may be attractive in theory, but in practice it asks for something many people aren't yet willing, able, or prepared to give. Healing requires confrontation. It means turning toward the pain we've spent years avoiding. It means letting go of stories that have defined our identity. It demands sitting in discomfort, re-experiencing wounds, and facing the behaviors we've used to cope, even if they've hurt others or ourselves. This isn't easy. The process is not linear, not gentle, and certainly not comfortable. And for someone who has spent most of their life surviving, the idea of healing can feel like a threat, not a gift. Many people don't reject healing because they're lazy or resistant to growth. They reject it because the conditions that shaped them taught them that survival depended on avoiding truth. They learn to dissociate, to suppress, to numb, to distract, and these strategies worked. They helped them move forward, build lives, maintain control. Healing asks them to dismantle those strategies, and that feels like dismantling safety. The mind whispers, if you stop running, everything will catch up with you. The nervous system screams, if you feel that, you'll break. And so people stay in cycles, not because they enjoy them, but because they feel more bearable than what healing might expose. It's tempting to believe that once someone is shown the tools, therapy, mindfulness, inner work, they will leap toward healing. But information isn't the barrier. Readiness is. A person can know exactly what they need to do to begin healing and still not take the first step. Why? Because healing requires loss. It requires grieving identities, patterns, relationships, and illusions. It asks for accountability, which often means admitting that you were wrong about yourself, about others, about the narratives that kept you safe. Not everyone is ready to carry that weight. Sometimes people aren't ready to heal because they're still too close to the source of their pain. They may still be embedded in environments that reinforce their trauma, families that deny it, partners that repeat it, cultures that normalize it. Healing in isolation is incredibly difficult, and without even a small circle of safety, it can feel impossible. And so they adapt. They find ways to function within the dysfunction. They become masters of appearing fine, experts at hiding what hurts, skilled at smiling through it. From the outside, it may look like avoidance. From the inside, it's survival. There are also those who build entire identities around their wounds. Their pain becomes who they are, the lens through which they see everything. It gives them a sense of meaning, even power. To heal would mean to relinquish that identity. It would mean asking, who am I without my pain? And sometimes that question is more terrifying than the pain itself. The wound may hurt, but at least it's familiar. At least it's theirs. When someone isn't ready to heal, they may respond to help with defensiveness. They may mock, dismiss, or distance themselves from those who are doing their inner work. They may lash out, not because they don't want healing, but because the presence of someone engaged in that process reminds them of what they've buried. The healed person becomes a mirror, not of perfection, but of possibility. And for someone who's not ready, that possibility can feel like pressure. It's especially painful to watch someone you love resist healing. You may see their patterns clearly: the self-sabotage, the projection, the unprocessed grief, and you may try to gently guide them toward awareness. But healing can't be forced on someone. It can't be gifted, demanded, or inspired unless the person is willing. And often, Willingness only comes after a breaking point, a moment when the pain of staying the same outweighs the fear of change. Until then, even the most loving support will bounce off the walls of their resistance. The reality is that healing is not always appealing. It can feel like weakness to someone who was raised to equate emotion with failure. It can feel like indulgence to someone who was taught to suppress their needs. It can feel like betrayal to someone whose pain has become a form of loyalty to family, to culture, to identity. Healing doesn't just ask the question, what happened to you? It asks, what are you willing to release? And for many, the answer is, not yet. Some are attached to the dynamics that cause their pain because those dynamics are the only forms of connection they know. If someone has only ever known conditional love, abuse may feel like intimacy. If someone has only ever known chaos, stillness may feel like abandonment. Healing disrupts these patterns and calls them what they are, but doing so means facing a reality that may be too raw, too destabilizing, too lonely. There's also the harsh truth that some people don't want to change. They may say they do. They may talk about growth, awareness, and emotional intelligence. But when faced with the actual work, the unraveling, the admitting, the feeling, they shut down. Change threatens control. It threatens familiarity. And without a deeper internal readiness, no amount of insight will move them forward. In some cases, the wound is too deep, too old, too woven into their sense of self. Healing it would mean revisiting places they vowed never to go. It would mean resurrecting ghosts they promised to keep buried. It would mean standing in front of the younger version of themselves, the one they abandoned, blamed, or ignored, and listening. And not everyone is ready for that kind of reckoning. Not everyone is ready to go back to the moment where they lost themselves, sit with it, and stay long enough to begin becoming someone else. Thank you.